You never realize how fragile a world is until you watch a man try not to break it. For 3 months, Carter walked on eggshells. He wore 80 pounds of dense core weights beneath his uniform just to keep his boots on the floor, dialing his grip strength down to a whisper so he wouldn't shatter their hollow bones. The nobles thought his careful slowness was stupidity. They thought he was a lumbering brute from a dying mud ball. Then the lady laughed at him, and Carter finally stopped holding back. Carter adjusted the magnetic clasp on his collar. It clicked with a heavy, metallic finality that felt entirely out of place in the room. Everything else in the grand foyer of House Aris was soft. The lighting was a diffused, pale lavender that cast no harsh shadows. The walls were grown, not built, spiraling upward in delicate, pearlescent arches that looked like spun sugar. And the people were glass. Lady Genevieve glided down the sweeping staircase, her movements frictionless. She didn't walk so much as she drifted. The gravity on Elysium was a mere whisper compared to Earth, barely 0.4 Gs. To Carter, every step felt like wading through a dream. If he pushed off too hard, he would hit the vaulted ceiling. If he gripped a door handle without thinking, the metal warped. "Carter," Genevieve sighed. Her voice was a crystalline chime, perfectly modulated to project without ever grating. She paused on the final step, looking at him with a mixture of amusement and mild distaste. "Must you stand so stiffly? You look like one of the garden statues, only significantly less aesthetically pleasing." "Standard protocol, ma'am," Carter said. His voice rumbled. It was too deep for the acoustics of the hall, vibrating in the lower registers where Elysian ears were unaccustomed to hearing sound. He saw her wince slightly, a tiny flutter of her elongated, elegant eyelids. "Well, relax. You are giving my guests anxiety before they have even arrived." She stepped past him. She was nearly 7 feet tall, yet she probably weighed less than 100 pounds. Her skin was a flawless, pale alabaster, her hair spun silver. Beside her, Carter felt like a block of concrete. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, packed with the dense muscle required to survive a world that constantly tried to pull you down and crush you. He wore the standard diplomatic guard uniform, tailored to fit his frame, but underneath the sleek black fabric was a marvel of human engineering, the inhibitor suit. Woven bands of weighted micro-mesh and lead-lined joint restrictors wrapped around his thighs, chest, and arms. It added nearly 100 pounds to his mass. It wasn't there to protect him. It was there to protect them. Without it, the difference in fast-twitch muscle fiber and bone density made a human a walking wrecking ball on Elysium. "I will try to look less intimidating, ma'am," Carter said, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead. Genevieve let out a breathy, musical chuckle. "Intimidating, yes. That is what you humans like to call it. I call it unrefined." She arranged a fold of her shimmering diaphanous gown. "Do try to blend in tonight. Richard and Eleanor are coming, along with the Duke of the Western Spire. I do not want them thinking I hired a primitive who cannot comprehend basic social graces." Understood. He didn't care about her insults. He was getting paid triple his old military pension to stand by doors and look imposing. After 15 years in the coalition infantry, fighting resource wars in the asteroid belt and suppressing pirate factions on high-G mining colonies, a soft detail on a garden world was supposed to be a vacation. But the softness was rotting his mind. He missed the weight of things. He missed the smell of ozone and wet soil. Elysium smelled like synthetic orchids and sterile air. There was no wind here. The planetary weather controllers ensured a constant, balmy 72 degrees, with gentle breezes scheduled for Tuesdays and Thursdays. There were no storms, no predators, no tectonic shifts. The planet was a manicured lawn floating in space. "And Carter," Genevieve said, pausing at the entrance to the grand dining hall. She didn't look back at him. "Do not speak unless spoken to. The Duke is fascinated by your kind, but he tends to ask tedious questions. Nod, smile, and look appropriately grateful that House Aris granted you a contract." "Yes, ma'am." She drifted into the hall. Carter followed, maintaining a measured, heavy pace. Heel, toe, heel, toe. He kept his center of gravity low. He watched the way her gown floated around her ankles. It took 3 full seconds for the fabric to settle when she stopped. The dining hall was an amphitheater of excess. A long table carved from a single piece of translucent quartz dominated the space. Floating glow globes provided illumination, drifting lazily near the ceiling. Servants, other Elysians of lower castes, slightly shorter but equally frail, were arranging plates made of spun diamond. Carter took his place in the shadows near the corner of the room, folding his arms behind his back. He locked his knees, then immediately unlocked them. You never lock your knees on duty. That was a rookie mistake. You pass out, you fall, you crack the quartz floor, you lose your bonus. He watched the room. Cynicism bled into his thoughts, cold and familiar. They called humans the Mudborn. The Elysians and their allied species had been exploring the stars for 10,000 years. They had conquered disease, poverty, and war through diplomacy and genetic refinement. They viewed humanity as a tragic accident, a violent, hyperdense species of apes that had somehow managed to strap rockets to their backs before they finished evolving, past the need to punch each other. To them, Earth wasn't a home. It was a statistical anomaly, a Class 9 hazard zone, a death world. They didn't understand it. They couldn't. To the Elysians, gravity was a gentle suggestion. The sun was a warm light bulb. Biology was a clean, orderly process. They had no concept of a biosphere where everything, from the microbes in the dirt to the weather in the sky, was actively trying to kill you. Carter took a slow, deep breath, tasting the artificial sweetness of the air. He checked the chronometer on his wrist display. The gala was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. He calculated the structural integrity of the quartz table, the load-bearing capacity of the spiraling pillars, and the exact amount of force required to snap an Elysian's neck. 4 pounds of pressure. That was all it took. Less than it took to open a jar of pickles back home. He clamped down on the thought, burying it. He was a guard, not an assassin. He was here to look pretty, or, as Genevieve put it, unrefined. He shifted his weight, feeling the heavy, comforting drag of the lead in his boots, and waited for the glass people to arrive. The guests arrived in a flurry of velvet, silk, and condescension. Lord Richard of House Corvus was the first to enter. He was exceptionally tall, even for an Elysian, with a narrow, aristocratic face and hands that looked like bundles of pale twigs. He was accompanied by Lady Eleanor, whose hair was styled into an anti-gravity halo that hovered inches above her scalp. Following them were 6 other nobles, a parade of pastel colors and soft, musical voices. Carter remained a statue in the corner. His eyes tracked the room in invisible grids. Richard, unarmed, Left leg favors a slight limp. Eleanor. Hidden micro purse. Possible energy shielding. Negligible threat. Vincent. Vincent was the Duke of the Western Spire. He wore a deep crimson cloak that dragged softly on the pristine floor. He had a sharp avian face and eyes that darted around the room with an arrogant intelligence. He didn't look at the decor. He looked at the servants. Then, his eyes landed on Carter. A smirk touched Vincent's thin lips. He leaned toward Genevieve, whispering something behind a long, graceful hand. Genevieve laughed, a bright, tinkling sound, and patted Vincent's arm. Now, Vincent," she said, her voice carrying across the low G acoustics. "He is quite docile, I assure you. Expensive, but worth the peace of mind. One never knows when the lower castes might throw a tantrum." "Docile?" Vincent echoed, drifting toward the table. "I was under the impression the Mudborn were entirely feral. My cousin hired one for his estate on Prime. Said the creature nearly tore a door off its hinges just trying to open it." "They lack fine motor control," Richard chimed in, taking his seat. He accepted a glass of pale blue liquid from a servant. "It is a biological tragicomedy. Too much muscle mass, too little synaptic refinement. They are built for digging holes, not operating modern architecture." Carter stared at the wall. He kept his breathing steady. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. The conversation washed over him. He was used to it. The galaxy was full of ancient, highly evolved beings who had forgotten what dirt felt like. Dinner commenced. It was a tedious affair of micro portions and endless toasts. They ate foods that looked like foam and vapor. Carter's stomach rumbled, a deep, predatory growl that he quickly stifled by flexing his core. He hadn't eaten since noon, and the nutrient paste in his quarters was severely lacking in protein. As the night wore on, the pale blue liquid flowed freely. The nobles became flushed, their movements slightly less graceful, their voices louder. The veneer of perfect civility began to crack, revealing the petty, bored cruelty beneath. "I simply do not understand the Coalition's fascination with them," Eleanor said, waving a languid hand in Carter's direction. She didn't look at him. She talked about him as if he were a piece of furniture. Granting them provisional status, letting them pilot starships, it is like giving a child a loaded plasma caster. "Desperation, my dear," Vincent said, leaning back in his chair. He swirled the blue liquid in his glass. "The Coalition needs brute labor, the mining worlds, the frontier outposts. You cannot send civilized beings to places where the atmospheric pressure crushes the lungs. The humans are expendable. They breed quickly, and they are surprisingly hard to kill." Genevieve smiled over the rim of her glass. "Exactly. Think of them as a very complex, very aggressive farm animal, useful, provided you keep them on a short leash." Carter's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He felt the heavy drag of the gravity limiters biting into his shoulders. The urge to step forward, just one solid, earth-shattering step, flared in his chest. "Stay frosty, Carter," he told himself. "It's just talk. They're fragile. They don't know." "I wonder," Vincent mused, setting his glass down. He turned his chair slightly, finally looking directly at Carter. "Guard, you there. What did they call you?" Carter shifted his gaze. "Carter, Your Grace." "Carter," Vincent tested the name, pronouncing the hard R with difficulty. "Tell me, Carter, is it true your homeworld has a liquid water ocean that is completely unpurified?" Just raw, churning saline and biological waste? Yes, Your Grace. Oceans cover 70% of the planet. A collective shudder went around the table. Eleanor pressed a scented cloth to her nose. Barbaric, Richard muttered. How do you not all die of bacterial infections? We have immune systems, my lord, Carter said evenly. They adapt, Vincent chuckled. Adapt, how quaint. They rely on their bodies to fight off parasites rather than using genetic purifiers. Truly, the Dark Ages. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the quartz table. Tell us more, Carter. Entertain us. I heard a rumor about your planet's gravity. They say it is... What was the figure? 0.8? 0.9? 1.0, Your Grace, Carter replied. 1.0, Vincent repeated, looking around the table as if waiting for a punchline. A full standard unit of gravity. It's absurd. Why, if I were to stand on a world with 1.0 gravity, my femurs would snap within an hour. Likely sooner, Your Grace, Carter said. It slipped out before he could stop it. The dry, cynical edge of his voice cut through the soft acoustics of the room. The table went completely silent. Genevieve's smile vanished. She sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. Carter, watch your tone. Vincent, however, looked delighted. No, Genevieve, let him speak. This is fascinating. The creature has a sense of irony. He stood up, slowly, his crimson cloak pooling around him. He walked toward Carter, closing the distance until he was standing only a few feet away. Vincent was taller, but standing this close, the disparity in their build was comical. Vincent was a reed. Carter was an oak. Yet Vincent looked at him with the supreme confidence of a man who owned the universe. So, your bones do not snap, Vincent said, eyeing Carter's broad chest. You drag yourselves through the mud, fighting off microbes under crushing pressure. And yet, here you are, standing perfectly still. You look almost stiff. I am on duty, Your Grace. Yes, but why so slow? Vincent pressed. He reached out and tapped the dark fabric of Carter's sleeve. I have watched you all evening. You move as if you are submerged in water. Is the lack of gravity confusing your primitive inner ear? Are you dizzy, Carter? No, Your Grace. Then move, Vincent commanded. He stepped back, gesturing to the open space of the floor. Show us this adapted human agility. Do a cartwheel, jump, run to the door and back. Let us see the apex predator of the mud ball. Carter didn't move. He looked past Vincent to Genevieve. Lady Genevieve, my contract stipulates static security, not entertainment. Genevieve's expression was cold. She was embarrassed. A servant had talked back. Do as the Duke asks, Carter. You are here to serve House Heiress. If the Duke wishes to see you jump, you will jump. Carter's eyes darkened. The cynicism evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard ember of anger. He had spent his life fighting for his people, bleeding in the dirt so the coalition could thrive. And now he was being asked to perform tricks for a room full of glass aristocrats. Ma'am, I strongly advise against it, Carter said. His voice was low, devoid of any subservience. Are you refusing a direct order? Genevieve demanded, her voice rising an octave. I am stating that rapid physical exertion on a low-G world while wearing Class 4 inhibitors is a structural hazard to the environment. Vincent laughed loudly. A structural hazard. He thinks he will damage the floor. Genevieve, your pet is delusional, Richard chuckled from the table. Perhaps he is afraid he will trip and embarrass himself. "I order you to perform, Carter," Genevieve said, her tone absolute. "Or I will terminate your contract, strip you of your coalition license, and have you deported back to whatever irradiated slum you crawled out of." Carter stared at her. He saw the sheer, unyielding arrogance in her pale eyes. She had no idea. None of them did. They had read the statistics. They had laughed at the numbers, but they fundamentally could not comprehend the reality of a Deathworlder. "Understood," Carter said softly. He reached to his collar. "What is he doing?" Eleanor whispered, clutching her glass. Carter didn't unbutton his uniform. Instead, he reached behind his neck, finding the recessed biometric lock hidden beneath the fabric. He pressed his thumb against it. The suit beeped, a sharp mechanical sound that cut through the silence. Click, hiss. A soft pneumatic exhale echoed in the room as the magnetic seals on his inhibitor suit disengaged. "I wear 85 pounds of depleted uranium weave and lead-lined joint restrictors," Carter said. His voice wasn't a rumble anymore. It was a flat, deadpan statement of fact. "It keeps my center of mass anchored. It slows my kinetic output by roughly 60%. He reached to his wrists. He unclasped a thick, metallic band from his left arm. It was black, dense, and slightly warm to the touch. "What is that?" Vincent asked, taking a half step back. The amusement was beginning to fade from his face, replaced by a faint, prickling unease. "A limiter," Carter said. He held the wristband up. It was no larger than a standard timepiece. 10 pounds of compressed mass. He let it go. The Elysians expected it to fall slowly, to drift down like a dropped datapad or a dropped glass. But mass is mass, and density doesn't care about expectations. The band plummeted. It hit the floor with a sound like a cannon shot. Crack. The entire room vibrated. The spun diamond plates on the table rattled. Eleanor shrieked, dropping her glass, which floated lazily to the floor and shattered a full second later. Vincent jumped back, his eyes wide. He stared at the floor. The flawless, reinforced quartz was spider-webbed with deep, jagged fissures radiating outward from the small black band. "By the stars," Richard gasped, standing up. "You see?" Carter said, his voice entirely calm amidst the sudden panic. "On Earth, if you fall, the ground doesn't catch you. It hits you. Gravity is a predator. It hunts you every second of every day. It pulls the blood from your brain. It grinds your cartilage into dust. It compresses your spine." He unclasped the right wristband. He tossed it casually onto the table. It didn't just land. It punched through the translucent quartz like a meteor hitting ice. A massive chunk of the table sheared off, crashing to the floor and sending a spray of crystalline shards across the room. Nobles screamed, scrambling backward over their chairs. "Carter, stop!" Genevieve shrieked. Her perfectly pale face was flushed with genuine terror. She pressed herself against the wall, her hands trembling. Carter ignored her. The heavy, sluggish feeling in his arms vanished. He felt light. Ridiculously, dangerously light. He rolled his shoulders. The air felt like water, parting effortlessly around him. "You called us primitive," Carter continued, taking a step forward. He didn't do the heavy heel-toe walk. He just stepped normally. But without the leg inhibitors, his foot hit the floor with the force of a hydraulic press. The quartz cracked under his boot. "You called us animals. You think we're slow because we're stupid." He looked at Vincent. The Duke was frozen, his mouth opening and closing, his avian features stretched in pure, unadulterated fear. "We're not slow, Duke Vincent," Carter said softly. "We are walking through molasses. Everything here is paper to us." To demonstrate, Carter didn't run. He didn't jump. He merely closed the distance between himself and Vincent. To the Elysians, it didn't look like movement. It looked like teleportation. 1 microsecond, Carter was standing by the cracked floor. The next, he was directly in front of Vincent, invading his personal space, towering over him. The kinetic displacement of his sudden movement created a localized gust of wind. It whipped Vincent's crimson cloak back and extinguished the nearest floating glow globe. Vincent let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He tried to stumble backward, but his hollow bones and low G muscles couldn't react fast enough. He tripped over the hem of his own cloak, falling backward. Carter's hand shot out. It was a blur, faster than Elysian eyes could track. His fingers closed around the front of Vincent's tunic, stopping the Duke's fall an inch before he hit the ground. Carter held the 7-foot-tall alien suspended in the air with one arm, his bicep barely flexing. The room froze. Nobody breathed. The music had stopped. The only sound was the gentle clinking of falling quartz dust settling on the floor, and the rapid, terrified panting of the Duke. Carter held him there. He could feel the rapid, bird-like thrumming of Vincent's heart through the fabric. He could feel the frailty of the collarbone under his knuckles. If Carter closed his fist completely, he would crush the Duke's chest cavity like a dry leaf. "My homeworld," Carter whispered, his voice carrying easily in the dead silence of the hall, "has storms that can strip the flesh from your bones. We have animals that weigh 3 tons and run faster than your hover cars. We fought wars with weapons that split atoms because bows and arrows weren't killing each other fast enough. We didn't conquer our planet through diplomacy. We beat it into submission. Because if we didn't, it would have eaten us." He slowly hauled Vincent back to his feet, smoothing the front of the Duke's ruined tunic with terrifying gentleness. "I wear the weights," Carter said, looking around the room, making eye contact with every single trembling noble. He met Genevieve's wide, terrified eyes last. "Because if I don't, I might accidentally breathe too hard and break your world in half." He let go of Vincent. The Duke collapsed into a nearby chair, shaking uncontrollably, burying his face in his hands. Carter took a step back. He bent down, picked up his left wrist limiter, and snapped it back onto his arm. The heavy click made several nobles flinch. He walked over to the ruined table, retrieved the second limiter from the debris, and secured it. The weight returned, settling over him like a familiar, heavy blanket, the immense crushing pressure of being a human. He retreated to his corner, folding his hands behind his back. He assumed the exact same posture he had held all evening. "My apologies for the structural damage, Lady Genevieve," Carter said, his tone returning to the flat, professional drone of a hired guard. "I will have the cost of the floor and the table deducted from my severance pay." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The nobles of House Aris stared at the primitive mud-born guard, realizing for the first time that the galaxy was not a garden and that the monsters in the dark were currently standing by their doors, keeping them safe. "Now," Carter said, his eyes scanning the room for threats, "shall we proceed to dessert?" Nobody ate dessert. The departure of the guests was a masterclass in silent panic. There were no formal goodbyes, no polite bows or promises to call. The moment Carter clamped the second limiter back onto his wrist, the illusion of the evening shattered completely, leaving behind only the raw, frantic instinct of prey animals, realizing they were trapped in a cage with a wolf. Vincent left first. He didn't even retrieve his crimson cloak from the floor. He practically scrambled out of the dining hall, his avian features pale and drawn, his breath hitching in his chest. Richard and Eleanor followed, their graceful, frictionless gait replaced by a hurried, awkward shuffle. They kept their eyes averted, deliberately looking anywhere but the shadowed corner where Carter stood. Within 4 minutes, the grand amphitheater was entirely empty, save for Carter and Lady Genevieve. The silence that settled over the room was absolute, broken only by the faint, crystalline tick of the shattered quartz table settling onto the floor. White dust drifted through the air, catching the light of the remaining glow globes. Carter remained in his corner. He rested his hands behind his back. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, hollow ache in his joints. The 85 pounds of depleted uranium weave pressed down on his shoulders, a familiar, necessary burden. He stared straight ahead, his face a carefully blank mask. He was already calculating the logistics of his deportation. He would need to pack his gear. He'd likely face a coalition disciplinary hearing. He wondered if his military pension would be frozen. At the head of the ruined table, Genevieve sat completely still. She stared at the massive, jagged hole in the quartz where Carter's wristband had punched through. Her hands were folded in her lap, her knuckles white. For a long time, she didn't speak. She just breathed, shallow and fast. "You are a monster," she said, finally. Her voice wasn't the musical chime from before. It was brittle, flat. "I am a Class 4 security asset, ma'am," Carter replied. His tone was perfectly level. Genevieve slowly turned her head to look at him. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a profound, naked comprehension. She looked at his broad chest, his thick neck, the heavy black bands around his wrists. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You let us mock you," she whispered. "For 3 months. You stood by doors and let my guests call you a primitive. You let me call you a brute. And all this time..." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting back to the shattered table. "All this time, you could have snapped us in half with a stray thought." "I don't have stray thoughts, ma'am. Not on duty." "Why?" she demanded, her voice suddenly cracking. She stood up, her diaphanous gown catching on the broken quartz. She ripped it free without noticing. "Why take the insults? Why pretend to be slow? If you are so devastatingly powerful, why wear the chains at all?" Carter shifted his weight. The floor groaned softly under his boots. "Because power without control isn't civilization, Lady Genevieve. It's just a localized disaster." He looked at her, his dark eyes tired. "You think I like wearing this suit? It chafes. It pulls on my spine. It makes me feel like I'm drowning in mud. But I wear it because my homeworld taught me a lesson yours didn't." She crossed her arms, shivering despite the climate-controlled air. "And what lesson is that? That just because you can break something doesn't mean you should." Carter let out a slow, heavy exhale. "Humanity spent thousands of years destroying itself. We blew up our own cities. We poisoned our own oceans. We learned the hard way that violence is easy. Restraint is the hardest thing in the universe. I wear the weights so you don't have to learn that lesson." Genevieve stared at him. The fear in her eyes was slowly warring with something else. a grim, terrifying realization. "Your contract," she started, her voice faltering. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Your contract explicitly prohibits deliberate destruction of property. I am aware. I expect my formal termination in the morning. I'll have my quarters cleared out by 0800 hours. Genevieve turned away from him. She looked at the abandoned glasses, the spilled blue liquid, the sheer, undeniable proof of her own fragility. She pressed her long, pale fingers against her temples. "Go to your quarters, Carter," she said quietly. "Do not pack your bags." Carter frowned. "Ma'am?" "I said, go to your quarters." She didn't look back at him. "And leave the suit on. I prefer you with the suit on." "Understood." Carter gave a crisp, regulation nod that she didn't see. He turned and walked out of the dining hall, heel, toe, heel, toe. He made sure his steps were soft, leaving the glass woman alone in the ruins of her dinner party. Morning on Elysium was always identical to the day before. The atmospheric controllers dialed the lighting to a soft, peach-colored dawn, and the temperature rose exactly 2 degrees. There was no dew, no morning chill. It was a synthetic imitation of a sunrise. Carter sat on the edge of his standard-issue bunk. He was fully dressed, the inhibitor suit strapped tightly to his frame. He hadn't slept. After 15 years in the infantry, you learn to recognize the shift in the air right before a shelling. The atmosphere in House Eris had that exact same heavy static. He hadn't packed his duffel bag, but it sat open on the floor, ready. He didn't trust Genevieve's order to stay. Elysians were notoriously fickle. By morning, her fear would likely curdle into embarrassment, and she would want the source of that embarrassment removed from her planet. At 0730, a sharp knock sounded at his door. "Enter," Carter rumbled. The door slid open. It wasn't a squad of coalition peacekeepers coming to escort him to a shuttle. It was an Elysian servant, a young male named Corin. Corin usually carried himself with a quiet, polite indifference. Today, he stood rigidly at attention, his eyes wide and fixed firmly on the wall above Carter's head. He looked like he was standing in front of an unexploded bomb. "Mr. Carter, sir," Corin said, his voice trembling slightly. "Lady Genevieve requests your presence in the solarium, immediately." "Lead the way," Carter said. He stood up. Corin flinched at the sudden movement, taking a quick step back into the corridor. Carter sighed internally. The secret was out. He was no longer just the hired muscle. He was the apex predator in the room. He followed the servant through the curving, pearlescent hallways of the estate. The solarium was located on the western wing, overlooking a sprawling, meticulously engineered garden. Genevieve was seated at a small, wrought iron table. She was not wearing a gown today. Instead, she wore a high-collared, tailored suit of dark gray velvet. It made her look sharper, less like a delicate ornament and more like a politician. She dismissed Corin with a wave of her hand. The servant practically sprinted out of the room. Carter stopped 3 paces from the table. He clasped his hands behind his back. "You wanted to see me, ma'am." Genevieve didn't speak immediately. She took a sip from a steaming cup of pale green tea. The manicured perfection of her demeanor was back in place, but the edges were frayed. There were faint dark smudges under her pale eyes. She hadn't slept either. "The repair drones will have the dining hall floor fixed by noon," she said, looking out at the garden. The table, however, was an antique, 300 years old, irreplaceable. As I said last night, deduct it from my pay. Genevieve finally looked at him. Her gaze was cold, calculating. If I deducted the cost of that table from your pay, Carter, you would be working for House Aris for the next 6 centuries. Carter kept his face impassive. Then I suggest you fire me. I cannot afford to fire you. She set her cup down. The ceramic clinked sharply. Sit down. Carter eyed the delicate wrought iron chair opposite her. It won't hold my mass. Then stand. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. The aristocratic mask slipped entirely, revealing a woman who was deeply, genuinely stressed. Duke Vincent is a petty, vindictive man. He is also the second most powerful noble in the planetary assembly. Last night, you humiliated him in front of his peers. You terrified him. He asked for a demonstration, and you gave him a nightmare, Genevieve shot back, though there was no real anger in her voice, just exhaustion. Elysians do not handle fear well, Carter. We eradicated our predators millennia ago. When an Elysian feels threatened, they do not fight. They scheme. They eradicate the problem from a distance. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you saying the Duke is going to put a hit out on me? No. Genevieve let out a bitter, musical laugh. He doesn't care about you. You are a tool, a weapon. He blames the one who holds the leash. He blames me. She tapped a data pad resting on the table. It lit up, displaying streams of encrypted Elysian text. At 4 a.m, Vincent moved a motion in the assembly to audit the trade routes controlled by House Aris, she said flatly. By 6, he had pulled his financial backing from my agricultural colonies on the second moon. He is economically suffocating me. And knowing Vincent, he will not stop at finances. He will want me utterly disgraced. Or dead. Carter digested the information. The political machinations of the Glass people were tedious, but he understood the bottom line. So, you need a bodyguard more than ever. I don't need a bodyguard, Genevieve corrected quietly. She looked up at him, her pale eyes locking onto his dark ones. The fear from last night was still there, but it was being channeled into something entirely pragmatic. I need a Deathworlder. Carter didn't blink. I don't do assassinations. I am not asking you to kill him. I am asking you to keep me breathing long enough to counter his moves. She stood up, walking slowly around the table. She stopped a few feet from him, looking at the heavy black limiters on his wrists. Vincent knows what you are now. He will not send conventional thugs. He will hire off-world mercenaries, Krogan syndicates, synth killers, things that are not afraid of a broken floor. Things that hit back, Carter noted. Yes. She looked up at his face. If I double your contract, will you stay? Carter looked at the delicate, alien woman. She was terrified, arrogant, and entirely out of her depth. But she was also surviving. He recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror every day during the resource wars. Triple, Carter said, and I get full tactical control of the estate's security grid. Genevieve didn't hesitate. Done. And one more thing, Carter added, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling through the quiet solarium. What? I get decent food. I'm done eating nutrient paste. If you want me fighting synth killers, I need real protein. Meat, not foam. A tiny, incredulous smile touched the corner of Genevieve's mouth. I will have the kitchens import a dead animal for you, Carter. Much appreciated, ma'am. The political Cold War of Elysium was over. The shooting war was about to begin, and for the first time in 3 months, Carter felt right at home. The House of Ares was a masterpiece of Elysian architecture. It was also a tactical nightmare. Carter spent the next 48 hours ripping the soul out of the estate. He started with the aesthetics. The diffused lavender lighting in the primary corridors was disabled, replaced by harsh, glaring tactical white. The delicate spun glass partitions in the grand foyer were dismantled and stacked in the gardens. They provided zero ballistic protection and would only turn into lethal shrapnel when the shooting started. Corin, the servant, followed Carter around with a datapad, his hands shaking as he cataloged the destruction of centuries of heritage. "Sir," Corin stammered, watching Carter drag a heavy iron oak antique credenza across the flawless floor to block a secondary access corridor. The wood shrieked against the quartz. Lady Genevieve specifically requested that the western wing remain undisturbed. The western wing has floor-to-ceiling windows made of untempered silica, Carter said, not looking up. He shoved the credenza the last few feet into place. The floor groaned. "It's a funnel. If a strike team breaches the garden, they'll bypass the doors and walk right through the glass. Block it up." Corin swallowed hard, tapping frantically on his screen. "Yes, sir." Carter didn't enjoy destroying the beautiful things, but beauty didn't stop plasma burns. He calibrated the perimeter sensors, dialing down the automated defense turret's warning protocols. Elysian law mandated a 3-second verbal warning before a turret could fire. Carter bypassed the vocal chips entirely. If someone crossed the wall with a thermal signature above civilian baseline, the turrets would just shoot. At 1800 hours, Corin brought him dinner. Carter was in the security hub, reviewing the overlapping fields of fire on the main monitors. Corin set a silver platter on the console. He lifted the lid with a look of profound nausea. It was a steak, or at least the closest approximation the Elysian black market could provide on short notice. It was a thick cut of dense, dark red muscle from an imported Bovari draft beast. It was seared on the outside, bloody on the inside, and it smelled of iron and rendered fat. Genevieve walked into the hub just as Carter picked up a steel serrated knife. She stopped in the doorway, staring at the plate. She wore a simple, unadorned white tunic, her silver hair pulled back into a severe braid. "Is that entirely necessary?" she asked, her voice tight. "Protein, ma'am," Carter said. He carved off a piece and ate it. It was tough, gamey, and absolutely perfect. The heavy, sluggish feeling in his muscles that had plagued him for 3 months began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning fuel. Nutrient foam keeps your organs functioning. It doesn't rebuild torn muscle fiber. Genevieve approached the console, keeping a safe distance from the platter. She looked at the monitors. The estate no longer looked like a home. The schematic was overlaid with red kill zones, blue safe rooms, and yellow structural collapse warnings. "You are turning my family's ancestral seat into a bunker," she noted softly. "I'm keeping you alive," Carter corrected. He chewed, swallowed, and pointed to a blue square deep in the schematic. "The climate control hub in the sub-basement. The walls are 3 feet of reinforced plasteel to contain the terraforming engines. I've moved a cot and a comms unit down there. When the alarm trips, you don't run. You don't ask questions. You go to the bunker and you lock the door." "When?" Genevieve repeated. "Not if. Vincent isn't a man who waits. His pride is bruised. The longer you're alive, the weaker he looks. Carter wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was terrified. Beneath the aristocratic ice, the reality of her own mortality was finally setting in. "You think they are coming tonight," she said. "I know they are." The planetary defense grid logged a civilian freighter landing at the commercial spaceport 3 hours ago. The manifest listed agricultural machinery, but the thermal footprint of the cargo was way too cold. It was heavily shielded. "Mercenaries. Heavy ones," Carter agreed. He picked up his primary weapon from the table. It wasn't a sleek Elysian plasma caster. It was a coalition-issue kinetic slug thrower, a shotgun. It was a brutal, ugly block of matte black steel that fired solid, depleted uranium flechettes. In the low gravity of Elysium, the recoil of the weapon would shatter an alien shoulder. To Carter, it felt like a familiar handshake. Genevieve stared at the gun. "I have never seen a weapon so primitive. Plasma is clean. It cauterizes as it cuts," Carter said, sliding a heavy magazine into the receiver. It locked with a loud metallic clack. "Kinetic rounds are messy. They transfer mass. When you're fighting things that don't feel pain, you don't try to burn them. You try to knock them down." He looked at the chronometer on the wall. 2,200 hours. "Go to the bunker, Genevieve." It was the first time he had used her first name without a title. She noticed. She didn't reprimand him. She simply nodded, turned on her heel, and walked out of the room. Carter watched her go. He reached to his collar, thumbed the biometric lock, and disabled the primary magnetic seals on his suit. He didn't take the limiters off. He couldn't risk collapsing the floor before the fight even started. But he loosened them. He needed his lungs to expand fully. He sat in the glow of the monitors, the taste of iron in his mouth, and waited for the dark. The breach happened at 03:14 hours. There was no explosion, no dramatic shattering of glass. The perimeter feed on monitor 4 simply went black. Then monitor 3. A localized EMP field sweeping silently through the gardens. Carter stood up. The heavy chair scraped against the floor. He didn't bother checking the comms. They were jammed. He racked the slide of the slug thrower, the sound shockingly loud in the dead silence of the security hub. He walked out into the corridor. The emergency lighting hadn't kicked in. The EMP had fried the secondary relays. The house was bathed in the pale, silver glow of Elysium's 2 moons, casting long, warped shadows across the pearlescent walls. Carter moved with heavy, deliberate steps. He didn't try to be quiet. Stealth was irrelevant now. He reached the grand foyer. The space where he had stood like a statue for 3 months was entirely transformed. The barricades cast jagged silhouettes. A shadow detached itself from the wall near the main entrance. It was massive, taller than Carter, broad and thickly armored. A synthetic, not a droid, a cyborg, a biological brain housed in a hyperdense, mechanical chassis. The red optical sensor on its faceplate whirred, locking onto Carter. "Target acquired," a voice grated, sounding like grinding gears. "Coalition human, lethal force authorized." 2 more synthetics stepped through the empty doorway behind the first. They carried heavy, shoulder-mounted plasma cannons. Carter didn't banter. He raised the slug thrower and pulled the trigger. The roar of the kinetic weapon in the enclosed foyer was deafening. A blinding flash of muzzle flare lit the room. A tight cluster of depleted uranium flechettes slammed into the chest of the lead synthetic. In standard gravity, the impact would have knocked the cyborg on its back. On Elysium, with gravity at 0.4 Gs, the kinetic transfer was catastrophic. The synthetic was lifted off its feet and thrown backward like a rag doll, crashing through the remaining glass doors and out into the courtyard. Its chest plate was caved in, sparking wildly. The other two reacted instantly. A beam of superheated plasma screamed past Carter's head, entirely vaporizing the top half of the iron oak credenza he had placed earlier. The ambient heat singed his hair. Carter dropped to a knee, the heavy lead of his suit dragging him down faster than the low gravity wanted to allow, dodging a second beam that melted a massive, bubbling gouge into the wall behind him. He pumped the shotgun, fired blindly around the barricade, and moved. He couldn't stay static. Their weapons were too heavy. Carter lunged forward, closing the distance. He cleared 20 feet in a single bound, the low gravity finally working to his advantage. He crashed into the second synthetic, just as it spun its cannon around. Carter dropped the shotgun, grabbed the searing hot barrel of the plasma cannon with his left hand, and drove his right fist into the synthetic's faceplate. Crunch! The cyborg's neck snapped backward. Metal warped under Carter's knuckles. He felt the skin tear on his own hand, warm blood welling up against the cold steel of the chassis. The synthetic wasn't dead. It didn't need its neck to function, but its optics were shattered. It flailed blindly, a heavy metallic arm swinging in a wild arc. The backhand caught Carter in the ribs. The impact was brutal. Even with the dense weave of his inhibitor suit absorbing the blow, he felt a rib crack. The force threw him sideways. He skidded across the quartz floor, his heavy boots gouging deep scratches into the stone. He hit the base of the sweeping staircase, gasping for breath. The third synthetic stepped over the barricade. It didn't aim its cannon. It dropped the weapon, drawing a long, vibrating thermal blade from its hip. It recognized that firing plasma at close range risked destroying the house entirely, and its contract likely stipulated retrieving Genevieve alive. It advanced on Carter, the blade humming with lethal heat. "Bone density high," the synthetic droned, analyzing Carter as it walked. "Muscle mass high, dissection required." Carter spat a mouthful of blood onto the pristine floor. His sides screamed in agony. The synthetic was heavy. It was built for war. Carter's 85 pounds of inhibitor gear suddenly felt like a death sentence. He couldn't move fast enough. The synthetic lunged, thrusting the thermal blade at Carter's chest. Carter rolled hard to the left. The blade plunged into the floor where he had just been, melting the quartz into bubbling slag. Before the cyborg could pull the blade free, Carter reached up and grabbed the black metal band on his right wrist. Click. Hiss. He ripped the limiter off and threw it. He didn't throw it at the synthetic. He threw it at the synthetic's knee joint. 10 pounds of compressed mass, hurled with the full kinetic force of a Deathworlder fighting for his life. The limiter struck the joint like an artillery shell. The metal leg buckled with a sickening snap, shearing backward. The synthetic collapsed, its targeting logic unable to process the sudden structural failure. Carter didn't hesitate. With his right arm completely free of the weighted restraint, he moved faster than the mechanical optics could track. He grabbed the synthetic's heavy, armored head with his bare hand. He planted his boots, ignoring the cracking of the floor beneath him, and twisted. He poured every ounce of his earthborn strength into the motion. The synthetic's internal strut shrieked, wiring snapped, sparks showered over Carter's arms. With a final, explosive tearing of metal, the head tore free from the chassis. Carter stood panting, holding the severed, sparking mechanical skull. The headless body twitched twice on the floor and went completely still. Silence slammed back into the grand foyer. The smell of ozone, burnt quartz, and human blood hung heavy in the air. Carter dropped the head. It hit the floor with a heavy, dead thud. He clutched his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The right side of his body felt dangerously light, entirely unanchored without the wrist limiter. He looked down at his bleeding hand. It was a mess, but the fingers worked. A soft chime echoed from the comms unit on his shoulder. It was Genevieve. The localized jamming hadn't reached the hardwired lines in the sub-basement bunker. "Carter," her voice was small, trembling with raw fear. "I heard the structural sensors. The floor is collapsing. What is happening?" Carter bent down, wincing, and picked up his slug thrower. He checked the chamber. "Just clearing the foyer, ma'am," Carter rumbled. He keyed his mic, his voice carrying the cold, flat detachment of a soldier in his element. "Stay in the bunker. I'm going hunting." The remaining mercenaries were systematic. Carter gave them that. They moved through the eastern wing with cold, algorithmic precision, clearing room by room, leaving nothing but scorched silk and melted plasteel in their wake. They were looking for the sub-basement access. They didn't know Carter was no longer holding a defensive line. He was hunting. Carter stalked through the maintenance corridors. The narrow utilitarian passageways ran parallel to the grand halls, meant entirely for the lower caste servants to move unseen. Here, there was no spun glass or delicate quartz, just bare permacrete and exposed pipes. It felt a little bit like the bowels of a coalition dreadnought. It felt like home. He checked his shotgun. 4 shells left. He wiped the blood from his right hand onto his trousers. The cracked rib throbbed with a dull, rhythmic spike of pain every time he drew a breath, but the adrenaline kept it distant. He stopped at a ventilation grate overlooking the gallery of ancestors. Below him, 4 heavy synthetics were advancing in a diamond formation. Their optical sensors swept the shadows in rapid, clicking arcs. The leader, a massive unit with reinforced gunmetal gray plating and a dual-barreled plasma repeater, paused by a portrait of Genevieve's grandfather. It didn't look at the painting. It looked at the thermal distortion near the floor vents. "Biological trace detected," the leader ground out. "Elevated temperature. Human." They were too smart to be ambushed in a choke point. Carter knew that. He didn't try to flank them. He did something their tactical processors couldn't predict. He kicked the grate out and dropped straight down. In standard gravity, a 20-foot drop in an 80-pound weighted suit would shatter a man's ankles. On Elysium, it was just a fast elevator ride. But Carter still retained his mass. He landed directly on the rear synthetic, 220 pounds of dense human muscle, plus 85 pounds of depleted uranium weave, hitting a cybernetic chassis from above. The synthetic spinal column snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The machine crumpled instantly, pinned beneath Carter's boots as the delicate quartz floor cratered under the combined impact. Carter didn't pause to admire his work. Before the crushed machine had even hit the ground, he brought the shotgun up and pulled the trigger. The roar filled the gallery. The fléchette spread caught the synthetic to his left, directly in the neck joint. Sparks erupted in a blinding shower, and the headless chassis spun wildly before collapsing against a pedestal, sending a priceless marble bust crashing to the floor. Two left. The leader spun, its plasma repeater whining as the coils charged. Carter pumped the shotgun, but the slide jammed. A warped casing, damaged during his slide across the foyer, wedged tight in the chamber. He dropped the gun. He didn't have time to clear it. A bolt of superheated plasma scorched the air where his head had been a microsecond before. Carter lunged behind a thick, structural pillar just as a sustained barrage of plasma fire melted the stone behind him. The heat was suffocating. The air in the gallery superheated, sucking the oxygen from Carter's lungs. "Target contained," the leader droned. "Flanking maneuver initiated." The other synthetic moved to the right, intent on catching Carter in a crossfire. Carter leaned against the pillar, his chest heaving. The heavy chest rig of the inhibitor suit was cooking him alive in the ambient heat of the plasma fire. He couldn't move fast enough to outrun a crossfire. The math was simple. He had to be faster. He had to be lethal. He reached to his chest. He thumbed the primary locking mechanism. Hiss. Clack. The magnetic clamps released. Carter shrugged out of the tactical harness. 40 pounds of dense core mesh hit the floor with a heavy dead thud. He undid the straps on his thighs, letting the lead-lined restrictors drop. He was down to his black undershirt and combat trousers. No weights, no limiters, just raw, unchained biology. He felt ridiculously, terrifyingly light. The gravity of Elysium suddenly felt like a joke. He felt like he could jump over the roof of the estate. He felt like he could punch a hole through a starship hull. He heard the heavy, metallic footsteps of the flanking synthetic rounding the pillar. Carter didn't draw a weapon. He stepped out of cover and grabbed the heavy marble bust that had fallen from the pedestal. It weighed at least 60 pounds. To Carter, unburdened, it felt like a softball. The synthetic brought its cannon up. Carter threw the marble bust. He didn't just toss it. He pitched it with the brutal, violent torque of a Deathworld apex predator. The bust crossed the 15 feet between them in a blur. It slammed into the center of the synthetic's chest plate with the force of a wrecking ball. The armor caved in completely. The synthetic was thrown backward, its internal power core rupturing with a muffled, wet pop. Carter didn't stop moving. He pushed off the ground. He launched himself across the room. He covered 30 feet in a single, low G bound, sailing over the bubbling pools of melted floor directly toward the leader. The commander's optics flared wide. It tried to track him, to raise the plasma repeater, but its servos simply couldn't calculate the kinetic trajectory of a human moving that fast in a low-gravity environment. Carter hit the machine waist-high. The impact tore the synthetic off its feet. They crashed through the double doors at the end of the gallery, tumbling into the estate's grand conservatory. Glass shattered around them in a glittering rain. Exotic, bioluminescent plants were crushed under their tumbling weight. The synthetic was immensely strong. It wrapped its massive piston-driven arms around Carter's ribs and squeezed. Pain flared, blinding and white-hot. Carter heard another rib crack. He roared, a deep, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated human fury. He didn't try to pry the arms away. He drove his forehead forward, smashing it directly into the synthetic's optical sensor cluster. Red glass shattered. The machine sparked, its grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Carter wrenched his right arm free. He grabbed the thick hydraulic cabling running along the synthetic's neck. He planted his boot against the machine's collarbone for leverage, gritted his teeth, and pulled. The synthetic thrashed, its metal hands tearing at Carter's back, shredding his shirt and slicing into the muscle. Carter ignored it. He kept pulling, his biceps bulging. The veins in his neck corded like steel cables. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the hydraulic lines gave way. Synthetic fluid sprayed across Carter's face, hot and smelling of ozone. The machine convulsed violently, its internal logic failing as power bled from its severed spine. Carter held on until the twitching stopped, until the red light in the shattered optics faded to black. He let go. The massive chassis crashed backward into a bed of crushed, glowing orchids. Carter collapsed onto his hands and knees. The silence rushed back in, broken only by the sound of his own ragged, desperate breathing. He was bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts. His side was a knot of agonizing fire. The world spun slightly, his inner ear confused by the lack of gravity and the sudden loss of the suit's mass. He stayed there for a long time, watching his own blood drip onto the alien flowers. The dawn was pale, clinical, and perfectly scheduled. The atmospheric controllers dialed the lighting up to a soft peach, entirely uncaring that the House of Eris looked like a war zone. Genevieve emerged from the sub-basement 3 hours after the shooting stopped. She walked slowly through the corridors, her tailored gray velvet suit untouched, but her face pale and drawn. She stepped over melted plasteel and the shattered remains of her ancestors' portraits. She saw the headless cyborgs. She saw the craters in the flawless quartz floors. She saw the brutal, undeniable reality of violence. She found Carter in the conservatory. He was sitting on a ruined stone bench. He had stripped off his shredded undershirt. A thick, makeshift bandage was wrapped tightly around his ribs, stark white against the bruises blooming across his torso. He had a damp cloth in his hand, systematically wiping the black, oily synthetic fluid from his face and arms. The tactical harness and the leg weights lay in a pile at his feet. Genevieve stopped a few feet away. She looked at the massive broken machine lying in the orchids. Then she looked at Carter. She had thought him a brute, a farm animal, a tragic comedy of evolution. Now, seeing him battered, bleeding, and entirely unchained, she realized the truth. He was a force of nature. "Are there any others?" she asked softly. Her voice didn't chime. It was just a voice. Human, almost. "No," Carter said. He didn't look up. He kept scrubbing the oil from his knuckles. "The perimeter is clear. The EMP field dissipated an hour ago. Comms are back up. I already sent an encrypted burst to Coalition Command. They're sending a cleanup detail. Discreetly." Genevieve nodded slowly. "And Vincent?" "The local authorities are raiding his estate right now," Carter said, wincing slightly as he adjusted his posture. The synthetics had deep core memory drives, unshielded, arrogant mistake. They have the financial transfers, the contract, everything. He won't even make it to a trial. His own house will exile him by noon to save their stock prices. It's over. For now. Genevieve walked closer. She didn't flinch from the blood or the smell of scorched metal. She stopped by the pile of heavy black gear at his feet. Carter dropped the bloody cloth. He reached down with a groan, picking up the heavy chest harness. The 85 pounds of depleted uranium weave clanked heavily. He slowly pulled it over his head, settling the crushing weight back onto his bruised shoulders. He grimaced, the pain sharp, but his breathing immediately slowed. The frantic, weightless anxiety in his muscles began to fade. The anchor was back. He reached for the magnetic clasp under his arm. His fingers, slick with sweat and oil, fumbled blindly. He couldn't quite reach it over the thick bandages on his ribs. A pale, slender hand reached out. Carter froze. Genevieve knelt beside him on the ruined floor. Her delicate fingers found the heavy metallic clasp. She pulled it tight and snapped it into place. The lock chimed softly. She didn't pull away immediately. She looked at the thick, bruised muscle of his arm, and then down at the heavy lead bands he was strapping back onto his wrists. "Why put them back on?" she asked quietly. "The threat is gone." Carter picked up the left wrist limiter. It felt incredibly heavy, but he welcomed it. He snapped it shut. Click. "Because I'm still here," Carter said. He looked at her, his dark, exhausted eyes meeting her pale ones. "The threat isn't the machines, Genevieve. The threat is me. If I walk around without this suit, eventually I'll forget. I'll slam a door and take down a wall. I'll shake a hand and break a wrist. I'll become exactly what your people think I am." He picked up the final limiter. He held it for a second. "Restraint is the hardest thing in the universe," he murmured, echoing his words from the night before. He clamped it onto his right wrist. The familiar, dragging weight settled over his entire body. He breathed out, a long, grounded sigh. But it's the only thing that separates a soldier from a monster. Genevieve sat back on her heels. She looked at the destroyed conservatory. She looked at her broken home, saved by a man who broke himself to do it. "You are not a monster, Carter," she said softly. "No," Carter agreed, slowly standing up. The floor creaked under his boots, but it didn't break. He adjusted his collar, locking his knees, and assuming the stiff, formal posture of a guard on duty. "I'm just a guy from a mud ball, trying not to break the glass." Genevieve smiled. It was a small, tired thing, but it was real. Not a polite, aristocratic mask. Just a smile. "Corin is in the kitchen," she said, standing up and smoothing her velvet jacket. "He is terribly frightened, but I believe he is attempting to cook the rest of that Bovari draft beast. If you are hungry," Carter's stomach growled, a deep, rumbling sound that felt right at home in the quiet morning. "Lead the way, ma'am," Carter said. He followed her out of the ruined garden. He walked slowly, heel, toe, heel, toe. The gravity of Elysium was weak, and the people were fragile, but Carter didn't mind the weight anymore. It meant he was exactly where he needed to be. Thanks for listening to Alien Woman Noble laughed at her human guard. He was from a Deathworld. The room froze. If this story of brutal gravity and human restraint kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share it with your friends to support the channel. What would you do if you were trapped on a fragile glass world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss another epic sci-fi HFY adventure. See you in the next video.